AstroPsych 400 Podcast for Sleep. It's time to go to sleep now. Time to surround yourself with positive vibes. You are who you are. Being weird is not a crime. Do you ever watch a TV show, listen to a podcast, or maybe catch a live stream on a particular platform, and you think, wow, I wish I could have been part of that discussion? That was happening to me earlier today because I was watching this episode of Playing with Fire, and the host was answering some questions, and a lot of them were about how do you overcome anxiety, and very specifically, how do you overcome approach anxiety, meaning the heavy negative feelings that someone would have, and the fear, and the overwhelming sense of I should not do this takes place when the person is trying to talk to somebody new. How do you overcome that? And I think that it's really quite surprising that I know a little bit about this because I mostly don't have approach anxiety. I'm an introvert. I don't always go out and talk to people. I spend most of my time in solitary settings, but I really began to notice from an early age that I didn't mind talking to new people the way that my peers did, especially in one-on-one situations. And I find that there's almost zero approach anxiety in that particular context. But even still, though, the true piece of advice is that I had to learn differentiate between approach anxiety and approach stupidity, because you can find a way to bring up the courage to talk to somebody, but ask yourself, what is it for? Ask yourself how likely it is to succeed, because it all stems back to the concept of taking action without a strategy will lead to demoralization. And people will definitely try to use this in the world of dating or even just the world of meeting new people. But firstly, how is the other person going to respond? You can find the courage in you some way, somehow, to go walk up to a person and ask them the most ridiculous question in the world, asking them if they'd like to get banged in the ass with a banana. And that will not get the results that you most likely want unless you want to troll or annoy them. Instead, that will again lead to demoralization some way, somehow. So differentiate between approach anxiety and approach stupidity. What is it that you're trying to seek? What is your ambition? How will the other person respond to this? What are the benefits of saying these exact things to people? And how does one achieve somewhat of a desirable outcome as opposed to simply trying to overcome anxiety so that you can say that you overcame anxiety? Some other pieces of discussion that I think are heavily connected relate to differentiating between emotions and logic. There was another question that was asked during the same program. How do you differentiate between emotions and logic? Or what is a good example of that? And the first one that I thought of was that, can you imagine somebody who's making a profile on a dating site and they're trying to talk to people, but they don't actually have any strong connections to the people they're trying to talk to? Maybe they have zero connections. And if this is a guy, he's probably going to approach this in somewhat of a logical way, thinking, I'm not in a relationship, I want to be in a relationship, so I'm going to get on a dating site and I'm going to talk to someone. And alright, I like this person's profile picture, so I'm going to send a message, hi, how are you, and wait for a response. That is logical. Even if there's the smallest bit of attraction, that's all done on paper. That's all done by working it out like a math problem. There is no emotion. This is the differentiation. There is no passion. There is no strong feeling of any kind. And I think that some people, especially women, are very much aware about how somebody can be trying to approach them, but not having any strong passion or feeling in what they are saying, and that will lead to the lack of any type of new feeling to be created because the person might not even truly want to talk to them specifically. That person might feel that way about anyone that they've chosen just off of a list. Well, I think this person would be just fine. I guess I would like them if I had the chance to talk to them. So I'm just going to say some things that I only halfway believe because this is what you're supposed to do, and I don't know any other better way to connect with people. And there was once a discussion on Free Domain Radio that talked about how some people try to go into the dating world like they're fishing with a net. But with dating, you don't want to fish with a net. You want to fish with dynamite. You want to bring everything to the surface and you want to examine every single fish that you can. There's the metaphor, there are more fish in the sea. Well, what you want to do is examine all of them until you find the one that's actually suitable for you. But thanks to Captain Planet and growing up in the 90s, I realized that fishing with dynamite is not a good idea. That is simply an explanation, but I do think there's a certain degree of truth in it, because a lot of people will try to enter into relationships very quickly, and this leads to finding what is called a low-hanging fruit. Maybe it isn't the best to compare people to fish or fruits, but it's going into a relationship that is easy purely for convenience. And then one person who does that is probably very agreeable, and they're going along with certain things, and the other person is probably waiting until calculated moments to release their destructive tendencies. Maybe after a month or 2 months, their personality is mostly different with the person whom they're in a romantic relationship with now, and this leads to a toxic relationship. One person is being taken advantage of, and the other person is exhibiting a bunch of unwanted behaviors without boundaries, and they are perhaps wallowing in their own toxicity. Because another honest statement that is almost never talked about is how people who are toxic or who are exhibiting the personality traits and behaviors that we would label as toxic are not always in some state of happiness or in some state of joy and bliss. Instead, they're often miserable in their own right. They just do not bring it to the surface all the time, and they're probably very scared of doing so. That is absolutely no justification for their behavior. The abuser is always wrong, and I hope you're fast asleep now, but I will say it again anyway. The abuser is always wrong because they have conscious choice. They have the ability to say, no, I'm not going to behave like this. They have the ability to decide, I'm not going to start this argument. I'm not going to say those rude and unwanted things. I'm not going to try to make the other person look bad and feel bad all the time. But when you have a problem, you have to find the solution. And a great way to obtaining the solution is to understand where the problem is coming from and how it works, and how should someone appropriately respond to whatever event needs to be dealt with. So it's very important to discuss the mechanics of what has created the problem in the first place. And in relationships, a lot of it is that someone has a lot of very outward toxic behaviors that aren't apparent immediately in the relationship, and another person is very agreeable. They're trying to smooth the waters and keep a light and airy environment. But then, slowly over time, the more aggressive person is going to do things that are just a little bit meaner and meaner, and then the agreeable person is going to continuously try to remove the conflict or just to appease the situation, or sometimes it's even about subduing an opponent. As I said, I'm a very agreeable person myself, and I would always think about arguments that I was involved in, and I almost never was trying to hurt anyone's feelings beyond repair or trying to just destroy somebody's confidence and beat them to a pulp. I was simply trying to get the other person to stop doing whatever behavior they were doing that was bothering me or that I felt was inappropriate. And yes, it looks like an argument, but it's not destined for overkill. Again, it's just destined to putting an end to the conflict. And I think that a lot of other people, actually, I don't think that, I know that, a lot of other people are not going to behave that way. They want to beat you to a pulp, if not physically, emotionally, and more frequently emotionally. They want to obliterate your mental well-being, and they aren't going to hold back just because they're winning an argument. They will truly have no limit. People are very dangerous, and I was also watching another show, and I heard something that reminded me of a lot of these traits of toxic behavior and just the overall general sense of nastiness in humanity. And the show was not about anything to do with relationships. Someone was giving a presentation on the environment, like a live stream, and somebody wrote into the chat that you're not helping the environment, you're wasting your time, you're not actually saving any animals, you don't know what you're talking about. Paraphrasing, but something to that extent. And the host simply said, no one told you to watch my show. If you don't like what I'm saying, you can leave. Go now. Bye. No one is forcing you to be here. And it truly reminded me of a lot of the comments that I had heard on Marvelous Work and a Wonder. Firstly, that when someone said, I don't ever want to hear what you think, don't come to me with your idea. If I have a plan that will work and is working, and you start telling me what you think, that means you don't care about success, you don't care about solutions. You're just trying to fuel the ego and your own sense of self-importance. And there's also another one that I think might even be even more appropriate, and that is that life can be like a social media profile. Whether you use Facebook or Instagram, Twitter, maybe even YouTube, and you have your page, and everyone else has their page. Post what you want, share what you want. But once you go over to someone else's page just to tell them that they're wrong, that is when you've done something immoral. That is when you've done something bad. And perhaps it's somewhat similar to that encounter that I was just describing. Somebody was telling someone that they were wrong, and almost certainly in a provocative way to get a particular type of emotional reaction. But the long story short is that no one asked for that person's statement in the first place, and secondarily, that person was only trying to say that the person was not thinking in the way that they wanted them to think. But they didn't even provide a solid alternative on what would be a better outcome or any reasons why the person was wrong, simply just saying that your idea is not good enough, therefore you are wrong. And I think that that just leads to the particular types of nastiness that can be experienced among humanity. But I think all of us will have to admit at a certain point that people can be cruel to each other. And it is somewhat mysterious because oftentimes the person who is being cruel might not want anything to do with the relationship at all. They are simply staying in it because they want to have power over somebody. And I will never understand that. how someone will pretend to be friends with somebody else just to dominate them. I understand how the agreeable person gets taken advantage of. They don't even want to be there, they just are going along with it for the general nature of agreeableness. But the person who is exhibiting more of the toxic behaviors, they are they might not even like the agreeable person. They are once again simply trying to dominate. And I was also thinking about several of the other friendships and relationships that I had had in the past, and I noticed that some people were very close to somebody who was a very dominant personality, and maybe even an alpha male type, if you will, and they perhaps really appreciated this person's leadership and direction. So once that person had moved on to some other social group, maybe moved to a different state, or perhaps just even on the days of the week when they weren't around that particular person, they wanted to assume the role of the dominant figure in social groups, and they thought that, oh, the person that I look up to isn't here. Now is my chance to be the dominant figure, and I'm going to start telling other people what to do, and I want this person to be the follower the way that I was a follower for him. And I think that that is a pure conflation of fantasy and reality. This person has a fantasy that they're trying to act out, but no one else agreed to participate in the acting out of this fantasy. And there is a big difference between wanting something and expecting it. I want everyone to be nice to me, but I don't expect it. If I expected everyone to be nice to me simply because I wanted it, then that would again be a conflation, fantasy and reality. And some people even think that if a person is trying to do this, just trying to use someone as a pawn on their fantasy chessboard, then they're not worth spending time with. And this person might even need professional help in some way if they can't truly differentiate between fantasy and reality. And I think that it is a complicated subject. However, I definitely also notice that when relationships are forming, a certain power structure takes place, and one person will often try to assume one of the more dominant roles. One person might take on a submissive role, but they won't always be excited about it, and this will lead to tension within the relationship. But I think what's even more important is that sometimes someone will be very clear with their intent. I'm not looking for a relationship. I just want to be friends. And then the person who hears that will not take no for an answer, and instead they're thinking, now is my opportunity to try again, even though this person has very clearly told me that they don't want any kind of romantic relationship with me. I'm still going to try to use emotions to manipulate the situation to my advantage. They don't think this in words, but instead with actions. They continually persist to try and do just that, manipulate the relationship to their advantage with emotions, and they think that this person must have never been around someone who is conventionally nice. Well, I'm going to try to be conventionally nice to them just to laugh at odd times, and I'm going to try and hug them a lot, and I'm going to give them compliments at awkward moments. And they think that they're doing nice things, but in reality, they are not respecting boundaries. They are exhibiting very bizarre behaviors, and they are making the other person feel uncomfortable. So, in some twisted form of irony, they're trying to use emotions to manipulate a person into entering a relationship that they do not want, but instead their emotional reasons are driving the person further away. And I think that this also is heavily connected to the governing components of brain chemistry. When I share my ideas about how human behavior functions, I've identified 11 major characteristics of human behavior, which I've learned about from various other people, the big five personality traits, the governing components of brain chemistry, which I learned about from Dr. Helen Fisher, and the spectrum of benevolence and tyranny, which I learned about from Eric Newman. And with the governing components of brain chemistry, there is dopamine, serotonin, testosterone, and estrogen. And to focus on dopamine and serotonin, a dopamine-centered person does things that fuel their own excitement, whereas a serotonin-centered person does things to fuel a collective excitement, more than one person being involved. And dopamine-centered people are very easy to observe, but they're very difficult to predict because they're doing things that fuel their own excitement. And I began to think about a lot of the behaviors that are exhibited by dopamine-centered people. They might be laughing at inappropriate times. They might be making jokes that only they understand. They might be talking in a very loud voice at a time that is uncalled for. They might even start screaming or jumping up and down and cheering without any reason that is visible to the other observer. Dopamine centered, they're doing things that fuel their own excitement, talking in silly voices, putting too much emphasis on particular words, maybe repeating words unnecessarily, like saying yes, yes, yes. And this type of silly behavior is fueling the neurochemistry in their brain, and it makes them feel a sense of comfort, euphoria, and most notably and most importantly, entertainment. During that show that I was previously discussing that was talking about overcoming anxiety, one person in the comment section suggested that to develop a sense of humor in social settings, study your favorite comedian and try to recreate their behaviors, and do this until you are able to incorporate it into your personality. And I think that that could not be further from the truth. I think that that is absolutely absurd, and it's simply not a good idea, because there's an enormous difference between being a stand-up comedian and being someone who is having a conversation at the lunch table, or whispering in your college classroom, or by the water cooler at the office if people are still doing that. And that is that everyone knows that the comedian is just putting on a performance. Everybody knows that the stand-up comedian is meant to do what? Comedy, to make people laugh. They understand the function and role of this person. Whereas someone who is just trying to tell bizarre and twisted jokes at the water cooler, in the classroom, at the lunch table, people might not always understand where the joke begins and ends, and instead they might begin to think that this person's talking about outrageous material. Maybe they are actually somewhat demented and twisted, and maybe they're not even safe to be around, because they are talking about things that are so ridiculous. Trying to incorporate humor and comedy from forms of media is not a guaranteed recipe for success. And another way to think about this is that there's the famous expression in show business, know your audience. Well, again, this all ties back to empathy. How does it make the other person feel? Approach anxiety versus approach stupidity. Taking action with a strategy. I mean, perhaps just acting like a stand-up comedian in your daily life will not allow you to socialize better, and if anything, it will create opportunities for people to point out that you're not acting like a worker in the workplace, you're not acting like a student in the classroom, you're not acting like a patron of the restaurant. And this should also be partnered with one of the iron rules for life, when it says on this list of points that never self-deprecate. And there are also a lot of components of stand-up comedy that lead to self-deprecating humor, putting oneself down, and I will guarantee that this is true. Never self-deprecate, because people will not find humor in it. They won't think, oh yeah, this person doesn't actually hate themselves. They're just doing this because they want to get laughs, right? No one will think like that. They will interpret it as a form of weakness. There was a rather interesting question that was also asked, and that is that someone said that he is 20 years older than some of his co-workers, and he is not even interested in the females romantically, but they still refer to him as a nice guy. Why is that? And of course, based on that little bit of information, it's not an easy question to answer, but I think that I would know the response, and that is that even though he's not trying to pursue anything romantically because he's much older than his female colleagues, and not interested in women that young, he's probably extremely agreeable and extremely sensitive. Agreeable meaning agrees to go along with what people want him to do, and sensitive that he will respond very directly and noticeably to what other people say to him or about him. And when you're a sensitive, agreeable person, people will only expect that type of behavior out of you. They're almost using you to play a role in their life. And I've been on both sides of this particular issue. And you talk to the sensitive, agreeable person because they're a good listener, they show genuine interest in you, they are usually somewhat pleasant. However, once they begin to change their behavior the smallest way, they make a rough edge statement, they make a critical statement, they say that they don't like the topic of conversation, they tell you anything in response, it begins to take its toll on the friendship because you're thinking, well, normally this person is so pleasant and nice, and now they're being mean and rough-edged. But the fact of the matter is, people don't always have one-dimensional personalities or two-dimensional personalities, and a lot of people have a big problem with that, especially toxic individuals. They view other people as just toys to play with, and once someone has a multidimensional personality, it becomes more difficult for them to predict how they're going to behave, and eventually they'll either get frustrated and terminate the friendship or relationship, or they'll try to use negative emotions, particularly anger, and sometimes even threatening behavior, to gain an advantage over that particular person, and this usually will last for a little bit until one person will end it. Maybe the toxic person will move on to a different party, meaning party like as in a host or a supply, or a person that they're taking advantage of, not a literal party, and the person who is being the victim of the abuse will reach a breaking point and then they will just terminate the relationship, leave in the middle of the night. Maybe they'll even say a nasty goodbye, so to speak, which the toxic person probably deserves anyway. But I don't want to downplay the role of being sensitive and agreeable in someone's life. People are very much aware of this because on those other points, on those 11 important factors of human personality, there is benevolence and tyranny. Tyranny meaning controlling behavior. And just always think about this when you're interacting with other people. Are they nice and gentle and caring? Or are they controlling? And just you can even think of it as a spectrum of how controlling somebody is. And if somebody is exhibiting sensitive and agreeable personality traits, or they're just a sensitive and agreeable person in general, then the person who is tyrannical and controlling is going to take advantage of that solely because they can, because they know that their words are going to have a particular effect on the person. They know that their behaviors are going to get a desired result from that person, and it is purely a manipulation tactic, and perhaps very frequently it is not a virtuous manipulation tactic, but again, expectations versus wants and desires. You might want people to be nice to you, but what we want won't always correspond with how we should expect things to go. People in our day and age, in all of humanity, no matter what, will probably try to take advantage of you at some point. Understand how the problem works, understand how people function. Are they serotonin centered or dopamine centered? Do they do things that fuel a collective excitement or fuel their own excitement? How do people function on a scale of controlling behavior? And of course, looking at the big five personality traits and connect them all together, and you will understand how to read people. Thank you so much for listening to AstroPsych 400. I hope you are asleep now. Good night.